And if gold takes center stage as the monetary king, as it should be, silver will go along for the ride. And there's an argument to be made that neither of them will ever come back down.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with the Miles Franklin Market Update. With us today is our president, Andy Schekman, for our weekly chat. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to see you, Elijah. Good to be back, and glad we're doing these weekly discussions. They're really awesome, and I appreciate your efforts.
Well, it's great to have you, Andy. And the first topic I'd like to discuss is about the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, the IMF just put out this announcement that there should be this new Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, to understand what that means, we need to kind of back up and say, what was the original Bretton Woods Agreement about? So can you give us some insight about that? And then why is this new Bretton Woods Agreement announcement, that we need this new Bretton Woods Agreement, why is that so important?
Well, first of all, Bretton Woods is in New Hampshire. It was the post-World War II meeting of the Allied nations who all agreed to have their currencies fixed in relation to the U.S. dollar, which would be anointed the world reserve currency, taking over for the pound sterling, which was the world reserve currency prior to the U.S. dollar. And so, I've been talking a lot, Elijah, about Bretton Woods for the last year, and it's really dominated what I've talked about. In fact, sometimes I think I've beaten it into the ground, but it bears mentioning and bears mentioning again. What came out of Bretton Woods were several things, including the International Monetary Fund and the classification of the U.S. Treasury as the only Tier 1 asset in the world. And if your listeners were to Google Tier 1 assets, they would see a riskless asset as defined by the central bank. So literally since 1944, since that weekend in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the U.S. Treasury market has had the benefit of being the world's singular Tier 1 asset. And I guess you could argue that a dollar, an account that was segregated would be Tier 1 asset also. As an example, if someone needed collateral, an escrowed account in dollars, or if a central bank needed collateral, an escrowed account in dollars would also be Tier 1. But by and large, when banks, central and commercial, would trade with one another over the last nearly 80 years, typically the only Tier 1 asset, the only collateral, the only riskless collateral as defined by these banks that was ever used was United States Treasuries. So if we go back to April of 2019, we see the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central banker's central bank, reclassifying gold as the only other Tier 1 asset in the world. And we've seen how the central banks have been voraciously accumulating it. And now, as you mentioned, we see last week the International Monetary Fund, 190 countries plus from around the world, that was born out of the Bretton Woods Agreement, saying we need a new Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, they were somewhat cryptic in what they were saying, but when we take a step back and realize that 2 years earlier, we saw the Bank of International Settlements reclassify gold. And when we take a step back even further, we see nations around the world, Germany, the Bank of Hungary, of Poland, the Dutch National Bank, all of these countries over the last several years have been repatriating their gold. And many of them have made announcements along the way that their drop-dead deadline for repatriation was 2020. A lot of things are fitting into place, Elijah, from the repatriation of gold by the world's central banks home, away from New York, away from London, away from Paris, the reclassification of it as a Tier 1 asset, and now the International Monetary Fund, made up of largely a lot of these countries that are asking for their gold back, are saying we want a new Bretton Woods. What does that mean? Does it mean gold will play center stage? I believe it will. I believe gold has a prominent role in what is coming next. You don't see institutions of this magnitude, of this size, making these kinds of declarations, going to these types of efforts to bring stuff home, repatriating gold that had been safely stored in the banks, supposedly anyway, of the New York Federal Reserve for the past 70 plus years. So it's a changing world all of a sudden, and that's really really capped, or an exclamation point alongside the IMF's request for a new Bretton Woods. So yes, I think we are on the cusp of a new system. Absolutely.